Greetings and welcome to the Dr. Dave Vlog series. It is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026, tax day in the US, I believe. And this is a re-recording of my analysis video of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, the well-known 1973 short story by Ursula Le Guin. Once more, this is a new sub-series of the channel that's dedicated to literature, or different types of poetry and prose. And I do these in two parts. So first, I read the work in full, kind of like books or poetry on tape. And that allows everyone to hear the piece in an unfiltered way. That is without injecting my own personal biases. So if you haven't seen the first part or read the story, I'll leave the link in the description below so you can hear it from yours truly. Or perhaps you could read the story yourself. It's available online these days, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And so now I'm going to share my reaction, so spoiler alert. But here's a brief recap first. Right? So the story has three main parts. In part one, it's really kind of the first half of the story, the narrator paints a vivid picture of this incredible town, Omelas, in which the people are remarkably happy and have built an almost ideal society where they're just about actually to celebrate the start of the festival, the summer festival. It was celebrating the summer solstice. And so anyway, it's very much a utopian depiction of this blissful city with just the right admixture of technology and resources to live a perfectly full and contented life. They're an intelligent and sophisticated people with no need for things like kings and soldiers or priests or slaves. There really aren't even many laws or formal rules as such. But at the same time, there's also no guilt allowed within the city either. And so it's just such an incredible depiction that the narrator asks you to imagine that they then say finally, do you believe? Do you accept the festival, the city, the joy? No? Then let me describe one more thing. And with that, we enter into the second phase of the story. And we basically, the narrator describes then the existence of this very small child who's locked in a broom closet, living this miserable and deprived life, basically forever imprisoned in that closet, not allowed out, not allowed to see the sun. In fact, the child can't even be spoken to. Not a kind word can be said to the child, and they're malnourished and living in their own feces, etc. Just a horrible existence that they depict. And the narrator then explains that, but this is just the way things have to be. In fact, they say that these are the terms which are strict and absolute. They cannot be violated. They all learn then about this miserable, abused child living in this broom closet. They all learn about this at a very young age, or when they're deemed old enough to understand. But why? Why can't they help the child? Why can't they provide some kindness? And the story, it's explained that, well, because all of the abundance and the joy are dependent upon this one child's misery, their continued abuse. And here's a key passage again as a reminder. Quote, they all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not. But they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of their skies depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. End quote. And so with that, we then arrive at part three of the story, where essentially everyone has to make a decision, kind of like the Clash. Should I stay or should I go? The narrator presents the choice as essentially a binary question. Most people stay, but every now and then a person will fall silent for a day or two and then leave the city. And so the narrator doesn't explain why, but just states that, quote, they leave Omelas, they walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. And so I think my first response as a young person reading the story would have been highly consistent with that almost kind of utilitarian calculation that tilts in favor of the happiness of the thousands, of the masses, versus the happiness of the one. I think that's what they talked about in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan as well, and losing Spock. But then they inverted the reasoning. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But I think from that sort of quite reasonable utilitarian perspective, you can make the case then that the much greater good of the entire community should take precedence over the suffering of the few, or in this case, the one child. In fact, if the trade-off is that an entire community or society can live in an almost ideal world, provided that only one child must suffer endlessly, then that seems to be, for many, the best option. That's the rationalization or the justification that the vast majority of the Omelas residents seem to subscribe to. And sure, they're troubled at first, but most accept the terms, and they strive to forego any possibility of guilt that might be associated with the tragedy of the imprisoned child. And yet, we are not pure utilitarians, are we? Most of us, as with the Omelas residents, would surely feel the disgust, as it's described in the short story as well, that's associated upon witnessing such horrible child maltreatment. Again, what we would simply call child abuse. You'd be arrested for that in a moment in our society. And we're not comfortable then with the process of destroying one child, even if that might yield so many other positive benefits or good outcomes. There's a certain cognitive dissonance then that's embedded within the paradox of Omelas. And so when I read the story, and I was in my early 20s at the time, I imagined that I would make the latter choice. That is, I'd be one of those who would walk away from Omelas, right? Since I couldn't accept the idea that my well-being would somehow be contingent upon the suffering of that helpless child, okay? But let me put my behavioral scientist hat on and dive a bit deeper now that I also have several more decades of lived experience. We know that there are children who are mistreated in this world, right? If we see that happening, many of us, most of us, I would imagine, would probably try to, or at least want to intervene directly. And while it's a fictional city, Omelas, how many of us could actually sit idly by while knowing that we could actually do something for that child? Now, the narrator recognizes this in the story, but again, offers this absolutist perspective that, as much as you might want to, you can't do that, because that would lead to the collapse of the society. And so my point here is that in the modern world, too, we know that there are people suffering, that there are injustices everywhere, including, for example, the countless young children who are exploited and upon whose labor we benefit with our inexpensive clothing and shoes. We know that to be the case. Are we not outraged? Well, maybe. Some would say, no, not necessarily, because it's not the same, right? In other words, it's other people then who are responsible for the horrible working conditions, for the exploitation, etc. It's not our fault. And I'd argue that's because we don't see the child labor, typically, right? We don't see the factories, the horrific working conditions. And in fact, we've done something quite sociologically intelligent. We've outlawed those practices in our own country, but we permit it elsewhere, right? And so we don't have to see the misery and the suffering, at least maybe not beyond those who are hungry and mistreated in our own society, I guess, to some degree, but I digress. Rather, my point is that we can cling then to our own moral superiority because we know that we would never enslave children. And we literally don't see what happens elsewhere in that regard, and we can sleep comfortably, perhaps even under the cover of the blankets that the tiny children could weave, so much more finely with their tiny fingers, certainly compared to somebody like myself with my big, awkward fingers. And perhaps most profoundly, most of us conveniently just don't think about what happens elsewhere in the world most of the time, because the world is, in this way of thinking, it's not one place. It's not one Omelas, right? The world is rather places like Canada and the United States and Mexico, and then, of course, the many cities and towns within these countries, etc. So all of that then diffuses responsibility. if we thought of ourselves as part of one world, one grand Omelas, I think most of us would then struggle a bit more with the knowledge that there are children who are still exploited, abused, hungry, and immiserated in many different places in our world city. And for that matter, we'd probably prefer to ignore the factory farming of the animals, right? And the cruelty that's inflicted upon them as well, so that we can enjoy nice meals with meat. Cannot live on bread alone, right? And how can we get around comfortably if we don't tap into the oil reserves and the natural gas reserves and all the precious metals that exist that allow us then to travel everywhere comfortably, to carry our cell phones with us constantly, and of course even to log on to watch YouTube videos such as this one? We're all part of the process and the problem, if you will, to varying degrees. So simply put then, in order to live in our modern versions of utopia, or at least in the modern world, however you conceive that, we have to accept all kinds of exploitation of other people and animals and natural resources. But we can justify our existence because, number one, aren't we, most of us, good, kind, loving people? And indeed, I believe most of us truly are. And secondly, it's not our fault that we have to rely on oil and natural gas and the degradation of the environment to enjoy or live a comfortable life. That's just a byproduct of history and where we, our location in the grander scheme of human development. And we'll do what we can, obviously, at the same time. We're going to try to reduce and reuse and recycle and be reasonably good stewards to the best of our ability. And indeed, most of us are not comfortable with the idea of animals or peoples elsewhere suffering or starving, at least not in principle. And sometimes we take direct action, right? Especially, for example, if there's a natural disaster. Many of us will rally to the cause, and many will provide help, all kinds of money, financial resources, other types of aid to assist people who are struggling or trying to recover from a natural disaster. My point is there's obviously a strong humanitarian impulse that exists among huge swaths of the population. But it's just the case then that we happen to also live in a world of global capitalism, right? With over 8 billion people currently coexisting and competing to various degrees for scarce resources. And we have, almost all of us, become enculturated into the 21st century world that embraces the new technologies and the lifestyles, even though we know that future generations might have to pay for some of this. Or perhaps we reason that, well, we'll figure things out eventually, or we'll solve the problems when we need to. And so here's what I do know then, after all of this. It's only the rarest among us then who would truly ever be willing to walk away from Omelas. In my, youthful nobility and idealism, I imagine that if given the choice, well, I would almost certainly be one of the ones who would walk away from Omelas. But now that I'm older, I realize more than ever that it's not a binary choice. Sure, plenty of people take the utilitarian perspective. They argue that we're best off making all kinds of trade-offs, and that some people are always going to have less or suffer more or struggle more, etc. That's just sort of the natural order of things. But why not, put this to good use and do what's right and help as many people as we can, given our different talents and abilities, and to the extent that we have to live together in this world. Sure, there's always going to be some kinds of inequalities and injustices. Of course, some people then do or will make an alternative choice. Some people do walk away from the world as we know it, the modern world, or live off the grid, or they buy an island, perhaps, in the extreme, or end up like Tom Hanks in Castaway. And then some, tragically, just commit suicide, right? Of course, that's not much of a solution, is it? I'm not sure that walking away from less than ideal conditions is a solution either. So yes, there's this whole tradition of utopian literature that's long existed. Le Guin's story challenges our conceptions in this regard, our understanding of utopia. She asks us then if we believe if Omelas is real before adding that twist in the story that makes it so much more believable. That is, that our well-being, if you will, cannot exist without at least one other person suffering. That our good fortune, that our very existence somehow requires that others should be less fortunate or would have to suffer. And it's kind of like the old question, well, how do you know then, or how can you determine if you're truly happy or wealthy or healthy if you don't have a reference point for comparison. And then we'll often take that to be our consolation. So in other words, we'll find solace knowing that, well, as tough as things might be, maybe in our own lives, in our own country, they could always be worse, right? As much as I might be struggling in Canada, for example, it could be much worse. I could be living in Ukraine or Iran or Palestine, in Gaza. Anyway, nowadays, I've arrived at a different conclusion. The third option, if you will. I think I'd rather just stay in Omelas and then try to change things for the better. Break the absolute terms and run the risk of ruining that ideal society by helping the child. Besides, I don't think I could actually live guilt-free under the conditions as stated in the novel or in the short story. But I'm not even sure that such a society could ever actually exist as described. And maybe that's the ultimate point of the story. Do we simply lack imagination? Do we lack creativity? Do we lack the energy and the will to continue to work endlessly to change that which we cannot abide? Are we willing to toil every day ourselves, not in futility and hopelessness, and not by walking away from Omelas, or just accepting that, well, that's how it has to be. That's just the way it is, like Bruce Hornsby used to sing, or Tupac, the late Tupac, actually sampled that and created another version of that same tune. But instead, I think our challenge then is to be these creative, energetic, problem-solving people, not perfect people by any stretch, and not people who just walk away, because that's the easy way out. Most people I've listened to who discuss this story, and quite intelligently, nevertheless focus on the binary option of staying or walking away. But I want to suggest now that I fully and much more deeply understand that really it's the third option that's not often discussed that makes the most sense. That is, even if we're not having our best or our most enlightened day and things seem to be falling apart around us, our job then, is it not to keep trying? Aren't we still showing up at work and trying to do the best job that we can, despite maybe the drawbacks or the limitations of what we do for a living? And are we showing up every day, maybe more generally, for the people and the things that matter most in our lives and in our worlds? And of course, that's the key. So for me, Omelas then is actually the universal global city in which we all live. Whatever our imperfections, whatever the injustices that persist, I, for one, will not walk away, ever. Because to walk away from Omelas would be to walk away and just give up on myself. Can't make a difference, so why bother? Never believed that. And again, no, we're not perfect, but we can and do make a difference every day with every kind gesture, with every piece of garbage we pick up, with every positive thought and helpful gesture that we can extend to all of the citizens and the creatures of Omelas, even the ones who annoy us from time to time. And again, that's what we're trying to do and inspire and motivate, I think, through the Dr. J vlog series. So in closing, I really loved the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, especially when I read it for the first time over 40 years ago. I was blown away, as I said in my first vlog. The thing is I just didn't truly appreciate and understand the story until recently, no cap. And that's why I don't think I could have ever done the Dr. J vlog series as authentically until now. It's taken me a lifetime to truly understand and to appreciate so much of what I found beautiful and inspiring when I was younger. And so I do feel lucky and blessed to finally understand much more in my mid-60s. I'm slowing down in every other way imaginable. But I do have the privilege of developing greater insight and understanding, and that just happens with every day and every year of living if we're committed to that. And so tomorrow, it's up and at 'em and back to work again in the only city in the world I've ever known and loved. And let's call it, for lack of a better place, Omelas. And as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.